Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Paul Kalnins, naturopathic physician and former professor of naturopathic medicine in Portland, Oregon. And welcome back to this 13th lecture on salutogenic terrain medicine, where in this series I've been exploring novel paradigms used in biology and medicine, including so-called natural medicines, in order to expand our understanding of the human being, health, and disease. If you like the content of this channel, please don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. And again, this is the 13th lecture in the series, and I'll be including a link to the last lecture below, and this is going to build on topics that I discussed there. So in the last lectures, to summarize, I ended the discussion with a summary of the 4 levels of organization, or we might call bodies, that comprise the human being. So we're not just one body, we actually have four distinct levels of organization. Each of these levels can be envisioned using a metaphor not based so much in molecules and genes or mechanisms, but rather in the language of fields. And so I discussed a little bit about fields, and I want to say a little bit more about that in this lecture. These 4 bodies or levels of organization are first the physical body. We might call this the mineral body, and this is the one currently studied in biomedicine. We might call this the corpse. The structures we study in anatomy and all of that really is part of the physical body. It's what we can see with our usual senses and with our instruments, microscopes and whatnot, that we can peer into these tissues. But we also can study this body using the language of molecular biology and genetics. And the laws that govern this body are the laws of essentially of the mineral world. So they're based in mechanics and classical chemistry. So that's the first body. The second level's organization is the fluidic or life body, which is referred to by the theosophists and anthroposophists and others in the Western tradition as the so-called etheric body, which I'll be using that word. Again, this is different than the ether of the physicists in the 19th century, as I explained a few lectures ago. But the etheric body is the seat, essentially, of life activities. And this works through water, and especially that structured water that I spoke about. So activities like metabolism, repair, regeneration, growth, and reproduction, all of these, we can say, are regulated by the fluidic life body, and they work through, of course, the molecules and the genes and so forth on the physical level. And again, this is highly connected with the structured liquid crystalline water, the so-called easy water in cells and tissues, where there may be novel, non-classical, quantum-like mechanisms that play through that, as I mentioned several lectures ago. These life processes are, in a way, largely carried by certain physical substances, and those are the hormones. So if we ask what is it that carries the activities physically of the life activity, of the life body, we can argue the hormone system is a major aspect of that. And that's why we put so much emphasis on looking at the hormones, and I'll be saying a lot more about that as we go here. Just briefly, again, etheric fields are very different than physical fields, such as electromagnetic or gravitational fields. They are what we might call non-centric fields. They seem to rise from the periphery and radiate inwards. And they have sort of holographic, non-local features. So that's why we say we haven't really discussed these in conventional physics or medicine to this point in time yet. The third body or level of organization that I discussed is the gas or consciousness body, which is referred to by the theosophists and anthroposophists again in the Western traditions as the so-called astral body or the soul body. This is the seat of what we might call the soul element. It gives rise to the capacity for sentient awareness, reflexes, instincts, feelings, and we might relate this more to the subconscious mind. So this is a field that's sort of above the life activities that governs these patterns that we have more in our inner psyche. Importantly, the astral body has sort of a catabolizing effect, at least one aspect of it does, upon the etheric or life body. And this is that important concept that we essentially sacrifice life activities for consciousness, which can lead to illness. And so that's the familiar stressors. Overactivity in the consciousness body can sap the life activities, which then need to be repaired and regenerated during sleep when consciousness leaves. So this suggests a very deep connection between our inner organs and our psyche, which again I'll be coming back to. As I discussed, there are really two aspects to the astral body. One aspect is related to the formative forces. These are astral activities that as if project down into the etheric field and guide the etheric life activities, especially in morphogenesis, and then later in life in the process of morphostasis, or what maintains our organ forms and functions. We might refer to these formative forces as universal astral forces, and in that all human beings share them in common. And they can be considered to be part of the astral body, again, that projects down into the etheric body. So in some literature, you might hear people discussing these astral forces as more etheric in nature. I would argue these are essentially the elements, or more particularly the phases, of traditions like Chinese medicine. So when they discuss earth, water, wood, they're referring actually to formative forces that are arising from these astral activities. And what's interesting, if you go back in the very earliest so-called classics of Chinese medicine, those formative forces, these phases, are connected with different planetary spheres. So it suggests that maybe through astral space, projecting into etheric space, again, this is all hypotheses, that these planetary spheres of activity can influence life here. We have some evidence of that, of course, in looking at solar rhythms, lunar rhythms, and whatnot impacting our physiology. It's not too far of a stretch to suggest that maybe a Jupiter rhythm, a Saturn rhythm, 28-year rhythm, 29-year rhythm has definite effects on physiology and growth of the human being. As I'll discuss more as we go here, there appear to be 7 of these formative forces. And they correspond with the endocrine glands, which are all arranged along a vertical axis in the body and are carried by the specific hormones from those glands. So we might think of the endocrine glands together with their corresponding nerve ganglia to be essentially organs of the universal astral forces. And these, of course, in ancient, the Eastern Indian and Sanskrit texts are referred to as the chakras. And they appear to different types of consciousness as sort of wheels of light, or lotus flowers or petals in a way. So they're not so much in the physical. The endocrine gland is, of course, in the nerve bundles, but the actual chakra itself is a whole other phenomena associated with it. I, of course, also discuss a different aspect of the astral body, not related to these universal astral forces, but more related to our individual soul or personality, which we use in everyday consciousness. So our feeling life, again, our instincts, our habits, all of these different things are part of our individual soul, which in a way is a sort of taken away from the universal astral forces. And these individual soul forces can have a destructive effect on the universal astral forces. And again, that can lead to illness. We take too much energy out of, or too much information in a way out of the liver process or out of the thyroid process. And this can result in for consciousness, which can result in illness. But again, this suggests a parallel between mental health and our physiologic health, and how we might be able to address mental health more effectively. We might think of those individual astral forces as destroying the negative entropy in the tissues, bringing about more chaos, releasing heat and other forms of energy, which are no longer structured and held in the tissues in this way. Normal everyday consciousness really has a catabolizing effect on these life activities, increasing that entropy. And again, that's why we need to sleep every night, essentially to remove consciousness so that we can start to repair and regenerate. If you learn to meditate in certain ways, for example, going from your normal beta brainwave everyday thinking into more alpha rhythms, or even if you're really practiced down into theta rhythms, this, of course, can have less of a destructive effect. In fact, can have more regenerative effect, and that's what we do when we sleep. We go into those slower, more high amplitude brain rhythms, which are associated with secretion of a lot of anabolic hormones and so forth. The astral body is experienced in higher states of consciousness as really a body of light. So we might call this also the light body. And it's filled with, the light itself is filled with different colors corresponding to our emotional states. And this is an aspect of what people often refer to as the aura. So that's from the traditional literature. What's interesting is that modern research seems to have discovered at least one aspect of this light body. And that is what we call today ultra-weak photon emissions, or biophotons in tissues. These biophotons essentially are generated in mitochondria in all your cells, via the generation of reactive oxygen species, and they're carried by microtubules and other molecules. These are called chromophores throughout the cell, and also into the spaces around and between the cells, the extracellular spaces. This light has been demonstrated to be coherent. In other words, like a laser, it's not just random from chemical reactions. There's an information structure to it. And it appears to be a separate cell-to-cell communication system in the body. And this is in addition to the known mechanical and chemical systems of communication that we already know about through hormones and neurotransmitters and so forth. So biophotons really are another set of communication links in the body. Interestingly, nerve cells, which are called neurons, they're packed together in nerves. Nerve cells themselves, which comprise the brain and our nervous system, many of them are highly insulated with the sheath called myelin. And this myelin itself has been demonstrated to be an ideal waveguide for actually transmitting biophoton information through the long processes of the nerves called axons. So in addition to the standard electrochemical signals that go through nerves, that we call the action potentials, this is very well studied in physiology, the research is suggesting there's a separate communication system in nerves involving light via microtubules, but also via these waveguides in the neurons. So that's one way that biophoton information is distributed throughout the body, is through the nerves. Another way is possibly through specialized channels, lymphatic-like channels that I discussed several lectures ago, now called the premovascular system. That too can work as a structured water waveguide for light to go through. So the easy water I talked about sort of serves as a perfect kind of liquid crystalline state of water for that light to be transmitted very effectively and very efficiently through, with very little loss of information. So although the biophoton is extremely weak, the channels for communication are very efficient at doing that. Both of these systems may correspond to what is described in ancient Sanskrit texts as the nadis, or in Chinese medicine as the meridians or the submeridians that come off the meridians. So these are maybe ways of distributing the light body throughout the fluid body and down into the physical tissues. Again, just like with the etheric, the light itself follows quantum rules such as superposition, non-locality, and entanglement. So studying the astral or light body field requires a move beyond classical physics and chemistry in order to account for all these novel properties. One final note I'll make about the light, and especially connected to consciousness. One of the leading theories, interestingly, of consciousness currently, and this was put forward decades ago in the 1990s by the American anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff and the British physicist Roger Penrose, is called orchestrated objective reduction, or OR. And it's based on the idea that consciousness actually arises at the quantum level inside of neurons, particularly in their microtubules. And this is different from the conventional view that consciousness arises from the connections between neurons. A lot of the current artificial intelligence models, AI networks and so forth, are based on neural nets, which essentially are similar to how neurons interlink. They don't take into account quantum effects. For example, what's known as a quantum qubit. And so this is interesting in that it suggests that consciousness is not the sort of classical computer-like thing that we've imagined, that it's arising from quantum properties. And these actually are not calculable like you can calculate a neural net. So it brings in the capacity for novelty and whatnot in consciousness. This is an interesting theory. Of course, you need evidence, and interestingly, this theory has made over the decades specific testable hypotheses, and many of them have actually borne fruit. So this continues to emerge, and again, it's one of the few, I think 5 or 6 leading theories of consciousness right now, but it's based on this idea of microtubules and quantum effects there. Another interesting hypothesis is that biophotons have a formative role, and that's possibly by changing the resting membrane potential, or the standing electrical gradients in cell membranes, by activating certain ion channels. And what's interesting is, as I mentioned several lectures ago, new research out of Tufts University, Michael Levin is one of the leading researchers with his colleagues, have demonstrated that these patterns of bioelectricity within cell membranes, Michael Levin refers to this as the bioelectric code, really is what regulates gene expression during morphogenesis. So unlike the current view, which is that it's, the patterns of living organisms are somehow stored in the genome and then the genes express the right proteins at the right time. That's actually never been shown for explaining an entire organism. Levin and his colleagues have demonstrated that just changing the electrical gradients in cells without knowing all the tinkering at the so-called hardware level of genes and molecules, they're able to bring about entirely novel forms, like putting an eye in a hind leg or something like that, just changing the bioelectrical pattern of the cells using ion channel drugs and so forth. So this is, another signaling system, the bioelectrical, in addition to the known chemical signaling systems using what are called morphogens that guide morphogenesis. So these really patterns work, bioelectrical patterns work in a top-down fashion to guide gene expression. And what I'm arguing is that maybe the bioelectrical patterns themselves are regulated by the biophoton field and by these higher, more subtle fields that I've been discussing. These are, we might call epigenetic factors ultimately, that have been mostly neglected in biomedical research. So it's great that Levin and his colleagues are really doing a tremendous job to bring this area of research into established institutional science and showing that we have a lot more going on in especially morphogenesis than just patterns of chemical gradients and just genes themselves. There's these bioelectrical codes that we have to take into consideration. Now, he and his colleagues have been using ion channel drugs and even hormones like progesterone to create novel biological forms. And these forms have memory, so you can have generations of the same form just by changing that bioelectrical code once, whereas the genes remain untouched. There's no gene mutations or anything occurring. So Levin is really arguing that this modulating this bioelectric code is really akin to tapping into software programs that guide living organisms, as opposed to tinkering the level of their hardware, again, the molecules and their genes. I would add further, this is not Levin, this is me, that these software programs are likely the formative forces I was discussing that stream in from the astral field into the etheric. In Chinese medicine, this is one aspect of qi. You might think of qi as those formative forces. Although qi likely involves much more than just standard electrical patterns, I think there are, again, potentially quantum and other more interesting properties connected with qi. Again, qi might be related to the biophotons themselves. Understanding these forces really, I think, would be revolutionary for medicine, because most chronic disease is really a problem of regeneration. If we can regenerate kidneys and the heart and the intestines, essentially know how to stimulate regeneration in these organs, that would cure most chronic diseases. We might argue it covers pretty much all diseases except infective diseases, although I would, I've had this hypothesis for years, and clinically, that when an organ loses its form, begins to degenerate, it's disconnected itself with those fields that organize the bioelectrical patterns and whatnot, it is now much more susceptible to infection. In fact, we might even argue that bacteria are trying to do a healing role. They're coming in, just like they do in nature, to recycle degenerating tissue. So it could very well be that having a bacterial infection is a sign that the bioelectric code and then the connection to the higher fields is somehow been compromised. And by correcting those fields, correcting that connection, the bioelectric code, would make one more resilient to infection. So this is all aspects of this third body, the so-called astral body or consciousness body. And then there's a fourth body, this level we've discussed, the warmth self-consciousness body, which in the theosophical and anthroposophic traditions refer to as the ego I body. And this is really the body that serves as the archetype for the human being. It connects us with an archetypal realm of higher thought, morality, creativity, and higher feelings such as love, ultimately connecting us to what we might call an archetypal realm of spirit, as opposed to our individual soul. So body, soul, and spirit really are separate entities related to these different levels of activity. As I discussed in the last lectures, this warmth body, by connecting to it in meditation, becoming more mindful, has a restraining effect upon the catabolic impulses of the astral field. And again, this can be accessed through different meditative states. Each body, as I've been discussing, has its own organizing principles, and only the physical, of course, is available to our usual physical observation. The other three, the astral, the etheric, the astral, and the I, become known to us through higher modes of cognition, which can be trained and developed using special exercises and meditations. And this is a big part of anthroposophically extended medicine, is to develop that. But many traditional medicines, Chinese medicine, there's a lot of practice in Qigong and other meditative arts, for example, to help bring about this understanding. We might call these bodies supersensory as opposed to the sensory physical body. And they have a top-down manner in which they instruct the physical forces, the biochemistry, the gene expression, and whatnot, unlike the current view, which is more bottom-up. So they turn the genes on at the right times, they maintain these electrical gradients, they regulate the chemistry and metabolism and so forth. And they do that through the hormones, they do that through the nervous system and potentially the biophotons and the immune system and circulation as well. I would argue, again, that biomedicine has things backwards. It really holds that molecules and genes are the source of all these higher levels of organization, life, consciousness, and self-consciousness, and that these levels emerge essentially from the molecules and genes. These levels, according to biomedicine, are epiphenomena of the physical realm of the molecules and the chemistry and so forth, and they're really illusionary. There's no special life activities and whatnot apart from standard chemistry and physics. But ancient traditions, and I'll really hypothesize that in the coming centuries, first in physics and then in medicine, we'll understand that the physical realm itself emerges from supersensory spaces or dimensions. And these are currently not discussed in biology and medicine. In quantum physics, it's already well known that the physical world of atoms and molecules essentially is constantly emerging from what's called the quantum foam, the quantum background, from quantum fields. And that atoms for specific elements really exist in the quantum field as probability waves in a special type of complex number space, which mathematicians call a Hilbert space. And these probability waves then collapse into the particles and the phenomena we see in the physical world. The physicist David Bohm called this Hilbert space the implicate order. To differentiate from the familiar world that of particles and everything that he calls the explicate order of our everyday reality. So thus behind every molecule, there really stands a field in the implicate order. Bohm argued that there's not just one implicate order, but actually many nested orders, one within the other. Although this Hilbert space, or the implicate order, the quantum wave function is just thought to be a mathematical abstraction. It's something that uses complex numbers, which are imaginary numbers. It could be, theorized that it's really describing a real space. In this space, we actually enter into with our subconscious minds and in our dreams, for example. This dream space really is a reality to our experience. And it's only materialistic science, which disregards our experience, that is based in particle metaphors, that really argues that this space doesn't exist or is not real. It's very real to us. We spend a lot of our time imagining things, going over things in our minds, feeling things in this special complex number space. It's a real psychic space to anyone dealing with human relationships or even things like emotional pain. And these ideas are very similar to more ancient traditions, which viewed the physical three-dimensional world to be nested within higher dimensional spaces, such as the etheric, the astral, and mental spaces, from which our supersensory bodies arise. So what I'm really trying to get at here is that the fields that comprise us, especially the etheric, astral, and I, come from higher dimensional spaces, not from physical matter itself, and that they essentially form our physical bodies. And the process, for example, of an embryo growing really is a process of fields coming from the periphery through the placental sheaths and whatnot, and forming this growing embryo. So it's a very different idea than something starting from cells and growing outwards. It's more coming from the periphery, and through process of division is causing the forms and the shapes that we see in the embryo. And that pertains to our I, ourself. We can argue that our I does not originate from our cells or microbes in our body. The I is something that stands above them and essentially organizes all of our cells, even our gut microbiome and our skin microbiome and so forth, into a whole. That's the I that is really the human archetype that we can connect with. And it really organizes us into a collective. This has really important implications for things like cancer. When I think of cancer cells as really cells that have lost connection to the whole, that have been decoupled from the higher fields, especially the warmth organization, and now are resorting to individual cell programming, which is essentially a basic algorithm for survival and growth. So we can think of this metaphor of the war on cancer to be fundamentally incorrect. That cancer really is your own cells that have decoupled from the whole. So just like a child that maybe has rebelled and left home, you don't want to fight the child, you want to essentially bring it back into the fold, and that's the same with cancer. And that's what Michael Levin's work suggests as well, is that cancer cells decouple themselves from the bioelectrical state in tissues and go rogue. And to bring them back into the tissues, you have to just restore their bioelectrical state, and I would argue maybe their biophotonic state as well. And they become reintegrated into the whole again. And there's a lot more evidence to support this arising now, and I can do a separate video on that if anyone is interested. Just put that in the comments below. We might think of our physical bodies really as the containers for these supersensory fields. More accurately, these fields actually form our anatomy, and they guide and they regulate our physiology as well. All right, so one concept I want to kind of close this particular lecture on is this has gotten pretty abstract and theoretical in fields, and there's still a lot I could say about proposed mechanisms of how the fields are interacting with physical matter. I won't go into that here. But we can really think of these four fields, the physical, the etheric, the astral, and the I, is working through four aspects of our physiology. And this will set us up for the next lecture where I'll go into this in more detail. But basically, we can see that the etheric activity, so first of all, there's the physical activity, which we can think of as working through our connective tissue, the so-called stroma in the tissues. And that is part of the physical part of our body. And biomechanics and whatnot, plays a big role there. The seat of the etheric activities in the fluids, but specifically what's dissolved in the fluids, and that would be the hormones and the growth factors, some of which are dissolved in a concentration of 10 to the minus 12th, 10 to the minus 15th, extremely tiny concentrations, which really have profound effects on the growth and the life activities in our tissues. And these hormones really regulate the bioelectrical gradients, but also gene expression and the metabolic activities in our cells. So that's the endocrine system through the fluids, which is related to the etheric body. And then the astral activity and consciousness through the nerves, through the microtubules, but also through the biophotons that I discussed here, through the nerve sheaths. And then finally, the warmth activities connected with our circulatory and immune systems. And each tissue, each organ really has a rich network of capillaries bringing oxygen and nutrients and hormones into the tissue and taking waste products and carbon dioxide out. So essentially, this medical discipline of neuroendocrine immunology is describing through molecules and mechanisms what I'm attempting to describe here through fields. There are two parallel types of explanation. I would argue that the field metaphor, as we'll explore in the next lecture, has some advantages over the quantitative mechanistic models that we're using currently in neuroendocrine immunology. The field metaphor, for example, we might think of the seven primary endocrine glands as the centers, the attractors for 7 fields, 7 frequencies, 7 vibratory rates, 7 rhythms that regulate our physiology. Every organ is essentially exposed to those 7 fields. And it's the balance of those fields within each organ which leads to proper health. In illness states, we might think of those fields becoming distorted. And that will take us to this idea of terrain and what historically has been referred to as tissue states. So that'll be in the next lecture, looking at how what people described as tissue states might be thought of as distortions of the 4 basic fields in the tissues. And that would suggest ways we can maybe try to support that, but also look for clues within the actual hormones, the neurotransmitters and whatnot. Look for patterns within those states. So that'll be coming up in the next lecture. And I think I'll leave it here before this gets too long. Again, if you like the content of this, feel free to subscribe, like, and share. And then I would love to hear any comments, any questions, any further areas people might want me to explore. I'll keep trying to link reading materials and whatnot with each lecture that's relevant to the topics I've discussed. Okay, well, thank you for listening.